I think that our HRBPs are no different, obviously in a lighter way, but very similar to the first responders that you find outside, like ambulance, the guys who work in the ambulance, the technicians who draw blood, the nurses, the doctors. In organizations, it's HR and HRBPs in particular that play that role. So I think it's important that we start looking at the kind of skills that we can give HRBPs to play the first responder role in mental health.
Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Linda, I couldn't help it, but for today, just for you, the bow tie is back on. And I'm really looking forward just to delve into this particular topic with you as well. To kickstart us, can you give us a bit of an idea of what is the work that you do at the Space Between Us? What is your goal?
Yeah, so thank you for that. The main reason that this organization is up and running is because of the fact that we believe mental health is core to everything that we do. And when you look at our environment, South Africa, and I guess Africa as a whole, we don't have enough practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists to tackle the problem. But even more importantly, our thinking about how mental health should be tackled is not only at an illness perspective, but long before illness, talking about it from a preventative perspective. And this is why we then decided to start a digital platform that has preventative tools on it to assist.
That's wonderful. I love the idea about preventative care because I think we've seen definitely as part of the pandemic, there is much heightened awareness at the moment around how do I avoid myself getting into trouble and how do I make sure that I'm okay and what that really means for me as well. I think interesting for me, there was a research done in 2017, and that was before the pandemic by the World Health Organization that already tells us that there are millions and millions and millions of people around the world that suffer from mental illness, and that's only the ones that are diagnosed. I think you mentioned an important point around accessibility to care and what that looks like as well. And I'd really like to deep dive into your perspective at the moment on what do you think is the state of mental well-being in this post-pandemic world that we are starting to move into?
Yeah, so maybe I'm going to take a small step back and say to you that even when we look at, from a national perspective in South Africa, we have only 5% of the health budget that's dedicated to mental health. And in that, most of it is dedicated towards mental illness and long-term care. So if the study you're talking about in 2017 spoke about, for instance, that 90% of young people who commit suicide between the ages of 15 and 29 have some form of mental illness, have some form of substance abuse, etc. So post-COVID, those numbers have gone up, not just in terms of suicide, but certainly in terms of depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders. We see these in our practices, and certainly the corporates that we engage with, the kind of problems people are talking about, people being at work but not being present, teams having different levels of microaggression, from absolute kind of disharmony to just small elements where you can see that what you're dealing with here is kind of the underlying elements of people feeling quite stressed and people feeling a little bit stretched given what we've been through over the past 2.5 years already.
And I also think in some of the clients I speak to, it's starting to manifest in very different ways in organizations, right? I think we are starting to see organizations also grappling with what does remote work look like and what is the impact then on my employees going forward, already on a very, very stressed and a strained workforce with regards to that as well. So Linda, help us understand what is it that you are seeing I want to talk from a work perspective and then we'll talk from an individual point of view as well. But what are some of these things that you've mentioned that we are starting to see in organizations, and what can leaders and managers do about it?
Yeah. So what we are seeing, I think let's look at it this way, Dieter. If you think about the last 2.5 years, what has happened is people have had to cope with something that most of us who've worked in HR for many years thought wasn't a possibility, which is the entire workforce enjoying the ability to work from home and try and balance that, and really look at their life more holistically rather than separating work, home, and play, right? So people were kind of forced into that situation. And many people actually eventually have coped. And I must say, a lot of organizations that we've worked with certainly have given a lot of talks to help people, right? They have provided a lot of mindfulness courses and all of this. Of course, we believe that we need to go beyond this.
Yes.
But be that as it may, there's been a level of adjustment as most people are quite resilient.
Yes.
There's been a level of adjustment. And now we're asking employees to adjust yet again in a very short space of time. Now, one of the key elements that certainly we've seen that our clients who've taken it up actually are coping a lot better. But what a lot of organizations don't realize is there is a mourning process that we need to allow employees to go through. There are grieving skills that they need, which, and you know, when you're talking about grief, you're not talking about something that comes and goes. You're talking about living with something until it has a lot less impact than it currently has. So if you're talking about what I believe we need, I think we need to look at the transition we're asking people to go through beyond change management and start thinking about what are the mental health skills our employees need to have in their back pocket to cope with this new world, which is now hybrid. And that's kind of the area that we're definitely playing in. So, you know, you're talking about skills like the ability to grieve, the ability to self-regulate, the ability to be adaptive, the ability to build relationships fairly quickly. So most of us are not relational beings. We like to think we are, but we're not.
Yes.
And yet connection is so important to us. So we need to teach employees this. You know, it needs to be part of what we do, very much like we used to teach time management.
Yes.
This is the new currency. Mental health skills, this is the new currency for employees.
I love it when you mention that, because I think there's this perspective at the moment that some organizations and employees hold, that they still haven't let go of what the world used to look like. And these periods of adjustments are just starting to compound. And I definitely think the grieving period, we haven't quite given that enough. It feels to me as if a lot of people are still in survival mode. And I can still hear a lot of that language that people talk about, you know, once when we get there, or as soon as we. And I think there's something powerful in teaching somebody that it's okay to mourn. There's been loss of freedom. There's been loss of connection. There's been loss of the ability to move around. And I think a lot of people have started asking the question, but who am I really? And what does that look like if I am a human being in this world? What does that mean and where do I fit? I have to ask the question, Linda, what are you seeing at the moment in terms of how people are trying to come to grips with that reality? I think we can talk about some of the great skills that you've already mentioned, but is there not a bigger question there around what people want from work and how they see themselves in relation to work that's also starting to play out?
Absolutely. And Dita, especially if you're talking about kind of your white collar workers, you know, the question of meaning and work. So, you know, we've seen the articles around the Great Resignation, especially in places like the US. We have a different phenomena, I think, in South Africa. We have the Great Migration, where people are moving towards parts of the country where they can lead fuller lives, and their lives can be as integrated as they started being during COVID. But yes, also questions around. So what we're seeing is people asking questions around, why am I here? The work that I do, how important is it? If we suffered the kind of losses in terms of death that we did over the past 2 years, am I doing the kind of work that I believe is worthwhile, given this huge kind of existential question that we've all been forced to really grapple with over the past two years? But what we're also seeing is a deep strain in terms of people's relationships. So it's interesting that corporates are surprised that they have to call us in to help people with their relationships with their spouses, their relationships with, you know, in an intergenerational home, with mum having to move in and mum-in-law and gran who doesn't have children.
Yeah.
Some communities are used to this, but not all communities are used to this. So people are showing up in corporates as they are, which is a big challenge. And then you find, in fact, just recently, you find leaders asking the question, do I have the skills? Am I enough? Especially having to have emotional conversations with people, and yet hold them accountable for performance. That balance for a lot of leaders is so difficult. They don't know the point at which empathy stops, and having to be quite hard and definite with people comes in, and then there's resentment and guilt that builds up, which is also what we're seeing. And that cocktail actually just means that we're focusing on quite an emotive workplace where people don't have the skills to actually deal with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because I'm speaking to a lot of leaders at the moment, and that mix between the expectation of productivity and expectations and show to us, that you will make this new hybrid world work on the one end, and then on the other end, there is this movement around being a lot more human-centered, being a lot more empathetic, trying to understand. And I love the movement around the whole employee showing up, warts and all, with the cat across the desk, with the dog kind of barking in the background. I think that is amazing for us as human beings, but I also get it that that's not the experience for everyone. And I want to touch on something that you mentioned, where something that bothers me a lot at the moment is when I look at what people are talking about and the articles that are coming out and what some organizations are doing, they are only really focusing on the white collar professional services type of environment and talking about what work means there. And I think we are missing a very big part of the conversation in terms of the reality that some people have to do a job, any job that is available, in order to be able to survive. Do you see that playing out? And when we get back to kind of from an approach towards work and a mental well-being perspective, that has to play in somewhere around the fact that why is there privilege for some and not for others? And that's something that I think we haven't quite scratched the surface on.
Yeah. So, I'm finding that with the organizations that we work with, certainly concessions are largely at and it's not at the same high levels that it used to be, where it's truly ESCO. So you do have a large majority of even, environments and roles such as call center environments where you actually are having to embrace working from home. So we're doing a bit of work with the large call center environment. And what I found amazing is from a tool of trade perspective, they've had to, during COVID, give people what they need to actually survive. But what's happened in that environment is so that's what they have. But because you're in your home, that's where you have the home coming in a lot more strongly into the workplace than you would want, because more often than not, that is not the employee that has the private study or that has the 10-bedroom house, right?
Yes.
So we definitely need to have the patience to look at what then do we do with that? Because while we all couldn't move, giving people simply tools of trade and giving them talks worked. But now that children are also going in and out, and yet as an organization, you've made decisions that people can work from home, I think the additional stresses that come from that, I'm hoping that organizations are not going to then take a backward move and say, everyone go back to the office, which is my biggest fear, to be honest, Dieter. Can I introduce one other subject here, which I'm not sure whether we're going to get to, which is quite important. So what we're also seeing, and we're busy doing some work now, around human resource business partners. So I've often said that I think that our HRBPs are no different, obviously in a lighter way, but very similar to the first responders that you find outside, like ambulance, the guys who work in the ambulance, the technicians who draw blood, the nurses, the doctors. In organizations, it's HR and HRBPs in particular that play that role. So I think it's important that we start looking at the kind of skills that we can give HRBPs to play the first responder role in mental health. Yes. Right? Those quick checks, the toolkits that help leaders talk about mental health, that make it okay. that help you identify. I think that's a critical element that we need to be looking at from a mental health perspective.
I can't agree with you more. I think there's been this realization on the one end, but where does that responsibility lie and that skill really lie within the organization? Because I think, us in HR, you get taught, when do I know when to refer, to the employee wellbeing program? That's kind of what you get taught growing up. And I mean, you and I can talk for days on the effectiveness of employee assistance programs. But I think there is, we shall not delve into that topic. I think what is interesting for me, though, is I definitely agree we need to equip HR differently. I also think we are going to, specifically for HR in this post-pandemic world, we are going to go into a bit of a period where HR also needs to learn how to take care of themselves first from a mental well-being point of view. There was a Forbes article recently that spoke about a study done that says something like 98% of HR professionals are facing burnout over the next period of time. And I can completely understand that with the emotional strain, with the new scope requirements, and I can only speak from my own experience. The first thing I think that happened was when the pandemic hit, there was this question of, okay, HR, help us. All of a sudden, you didn't have to fight for the seat around the table. You got invited with open arms to be able to sit there and have the conversation. How do we solve this, Linda? I mean, what are some of the things that we can do to help build these skills? And then especially with a very strong focus on mental health.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a thing that I'm really keen on right now. There's a beautiful study that was done in El Salvador around providing mental health skills. So the stat goes something like, Dieter, and anyone can correct me, I'm quite happy for that. That portion of South America has 1/8 of the world's population and something like 23% of the world's murders, something to that effect, right?
Wow.
So the psychologists in that environment have actually created training programs for teachers, for priests, for nurses, mental health screening, basic mental health counseling, and all of this. And I think that's where we're going to have to go with HRBPs, because they stand, and they always have, but it's even more important now. HR stands as almost the fulcrum between some managers who continue to want people back at work, employees who have felt the joy of running your own business, yet being employed, and their own kind of mental health and their own stresses and strains with their families. So they stand in the middle, and they have to try and navigate this tension, which means that they're playing the same role. So I think programs around how they are provided with toolkits, and toolkits are not difficult things. So one of the questions we often get asked is, how do I engage people in a Zoom call, especially if somebody is crying, and so maybe you and I are looking at each other thinking, of course you should know it. But when you have 20 people on the call, it's a team, you're a manager, which to some people almost means you're superhuman. You need to do some magic to actually, to pull this team together, to be able to contain that and that environment whilst making sure that the person doesn't feel that they're not being seen or heard. And those are things that some of us have learned as psychologists, but also as HR people, which we now need to teach.
I think you're spot on. I think there is this almost rethinking reality that we have to say, if this is what the human being in the future is going to look like, as a leader and a manager, what are those things that I need to be able to do? And I think almost taking it to the people is a much better approach. This is now a very fictional example that comes out of a series, but what I loved in the series, it was a doctor who went out into local barbershops and he taught the barbers how to measure blood pressure, because he says the people that pass through the barbershop are the people that will never ever end up in his hospital, and he wants to make sure that there's reach and that there's education in the community. I think as HR, we don't educate ourselves enough on really mental well-being and equip ourselves enough on the first end. And then the second piece, I think you're absolutely right in terms of management and leadership 101. There should be something in there that let's talk to you about how you do this. Do not switch your camera off when somebody starts crying because it makes you feel uncomfortable. What are those basics and those tips and things that we do need to look at? Linda, I want to ask the question to you in terms of the work that you are doing with the space between us. I'm extremely interested in, you've consciously decided that it's a blend between a digital platform to make it accessible towards people. What are you seeing that's different in this type of approach versus the approach that, let's say, was relevant 5, 10, 15 years ago, that was very much face-to-face, very much on a referral basis? Somebody had to notice something wasn't going well with somebody else, or I had to put up my hand to say, I need help. What are you seeing in this preventative digital space? What's happening more and more?
Yeah. So certainly we can see the generational differences. Generations younger than us are almost wearing mental health on their sleeves, and certainly mental illness. I'm a depressive, people say. I'm an anxious person generally, people generally say. So what we're finding is the younger generation is more willing to go and fetch tools, articles, podcasts that will help. There's a greater level of awareness. What is quite interesting is because so much is available in the world in terms of information, what we're also finding is the ability to curate and point people to trusted resources seems to be a really big request and a very big need right now. And then what we're also finding is, and we shouldn't be surprised by this, is our model talks very much of let's have contact first, and then after that, let's allow you to take your journey, because we see mental health as a continuum, where on the one end of the continuum, you're thriving and you're healthy. And on the other end, you're mentally ill and you may need to be on medication or hospitalized, right? But we move through this continuum. And this is what you ask. If you're asking me, well, what do I see? What I see is once people recognize that it's not an either or, which is where the stigma comes from. It's either you're healthy or you're ill, right?
Yeah.
So it's not an either or, it is a continuum. And along that continuum, there are tools that can help you not get to the very end, right? So once people get that, then the ease with which they come back and consume articles, podcasts is increased. It's much higher. But a lot of work, especially with organization, work has to go in to invite people into this conversation of it's not either or. It actually is a journey and it's a continuum. And if you have the skills, when something difficult happens, because it will, you then know how to reframe your thinking. You then know how to stop and breathe, and you know why the vagal nerve is actually important in relaxing you. You know those things. You're aware, you're in touch, and you're able not to get to the far end.
I definitely think it also points towards, I think that's always been the challenge around the fact that, mental health was a taboo topic and mental illness was a taboo topic. And especially in organizations, there was such a stigma associated with, those people that go for the help that's provided by the organization. And something that I'm really hoping the pandemic has done for us is it's given us language to talk about these things, and has given us the opportunity also for people to be a lot more transparent, obviously within the means and within where they feel comfortable, but to be able to say, I am somebody that has to, and I can use a practical example of AIHR. We had somebody comment on one of our Slack channels the other day to say, I'm struggling a bit. Does anybody know of what resources have helped you over the past period? And is there something that I can tap into in the form of content? I think the curation becomes important, like you mentioned. I think because otherwise we can also lead people. My biggest fear sometimes is that people find out about the DSM and they take the DSM and then they start reading it on page 1. And by page 17, they realize that everything they've written about somewhere in their life they can identify, which is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. As organizations, let's focus on that. What are the steps organizations can take, and what would you advise organizations to do in order to build a healthy, thriving workforce along this particular continuum?
So Dita, one of the things that I do recognize is it's easy to look at a one-stop solution. You pay once, it's subscription, it's done, right? But if there's something we have learned with COVID is that we are at a point where we have to differentiate the value proposition, right? Whether we differentiate that along the archetypes, as in married women dealing with being single and children, or whatever the archetypes are, the differentiation has got to be beyond one, one sock fits all. So for me, one of the most important things, firstly, is to acknowledge that the value proposition is going to have to be different. And if we're saying people are truly our greatest assets, then we take the time to allow that differentiation to happen. But the second thing is to provide. So I mean, the way, if you think about how one becomes mentally healthy, there is a level of awareness that's recognized, necessary, and that's where you do the talks and you get people to just engage with the information really from a cognitive perspective. But if you want to build habits, which is what we want to build mental healthy habits, then you need to recognize that there is investment in training that has to be done as organizations. And that training is fluffy sometimes in terms of, it's not like, but if you truly understand how the brain works, how the mind works, how the autonomic system works, then you'll recognize how the impact of what you are doing. So really having, thirdly, a preemptive view of what you're trying to do. So quite a few organizations now, Dita, have either femicides of employees who are married, or dire cases of kind of schizophrenia showing up in the workplace, people really, I guess, being disoriented, being in a meeting, seeing things on the wall, that sort of thing. So there are few organizations, one or two at least, that we work with where that has happened. And then that's kind of spurred people along to say, hey, there's something a little bit deeper here that we haven't looked at, especially when you're talking about the youth market, our top talent, right?
Yes.
And what becomes important for me is to actually realize that there is something under the surface. So what you would need to do to begin with is you would need to make sure, A, that you're differentiating for the kind of program that you want, B, that you are going beyond talks and you're actually giving people skills that they can work with. But C, which I think is very important, is it's your journey. It's the individual's journey. So before wellness programs, what we did is we built it and we said, come, we've got all these amazing things. And then you had a take up of 10% if you're lucky, paying millions of rands, and you wondered why. I think it's important that our efforts go towards getting people to understand that this is your journey. It's a journey. Yes. So you take ownership of it, not the organization. Some high-end organizations that we work with, for instance, subsidize some of the really amazing apps, but the rest individuals have to do. So that you've actually got a bit of skin in the game. So just our way of thinking about wellness and separating the different types of wellnesses, I think becomes important.
Yeah, I agree with you there, because I think that's wonderful, because I think there's so much good points in there. The first one is understand the science a bit better of how this really, really works, I think, from an organization's perspective. The second one is there is dual responsibility around, on the one end, organizations providing the resources and the avenue, but also for the individual owning their own journey. Something that I get worried about when I speak to a lot of people at the moment is there's still this victim-like mentality of learned helplessness pertaining to what happened. COVID happened to me. It happened to all of us. But now you have to make a decision, which I think sometimes is first a cognitive one, to move on and to move forward as part of that. Love that archetype thinking. I think understand the holistic human being. I spoke to somebody earlier in the week and I said, if you really want to drive an engaging employee experience, I said, forget about employees and start asking the question, who are the humans in your organization? Because sometimes we just bucket people according to, demographic reports or demographic parameters. Linda, last question from my side before we wrap up. advice to the HR professional listening today? If there's 2 pieces of advice that you could give to them going forward, what would that be?
It's interesting because one of the first things I said when the pandemic started was, psychologists, it's our time. It's our time to stand up and shine. And I think that's the same for the HR professional. So the HR professional is still entrusted with knowing more than the ordinary person around what human beings in the organizations need. Which means that then as HR practitioners, the ability to actually educate ourselves where mental health is concerned is critical, and surround ourselves with the right kind of psychologists, I think. So this is a time where we need to respect the profession and make sure that we actually have them close to us, especially psychologists who are in clinical practice. Because that's a different type of psychology, and that's the kind of psychology that we're trying to get close to at this point. I think that's the one thing that's very important. I think the other thing is being brave. So before we were asked to have a business case for everything, and and that's fine. We still need a business case, but now we actually have to be brave about the solutions. Some of what we thought was correct in terms of well-being isn't. We actually must pull it apart. We must pull it apart, and we must enable different players to add to our solution, and not kind of think one size is going to fit all. Especially now where we are being allowed to bring mental health to the table, to the boardroom table. I think we must use that. It's going to be one of those key elements that helps us push the people agenda forward. I really think so.
Perfect. I think that's great advice, Linda, for all the HR professionals listening today. From my side, a very big thank you for sharing your insights and sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you for the wonderful work you do at the Space Between Us. Where can people get hold of you if they want to reach out? Is LinkedIn the best format?
LinkedIn is the best format. Otherwise, our website is also www.thespacebetweenus, one word, .africa.
Perfect. Linda, from my side, a very big thank you. Thank you for joining me today. And we'll chat again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation, Dieter. You take care. You're doing good work. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Linda. Keep well. Bye-bye.